Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 31, the Hiphil stem with weak verbs. Now, before you're ready to move on to this chapter and study the Hiphil stem with weak verbs, it's essential that you have first mastered all of the strong verb diagnostics for the Hiphil stem. So again, before you engage in the material in this chapter, make sure that you're able to faithfully and accurately reproduce the diagnostics for the Hiphil stem strong verb. But having done that, you're now ready to engage the Hiphil stem with weak verbs. So let's begin. Look at your screen with me. The first weak verb we're going to look at with the Hiphil stem is the one guttural weak verb, And so you see on your screen the diagnostic features for this one guttural verb, the verbal root amath, ayin, mim, dalet. Now the good news is that the vast majority of strong verb diagnostics are maintained for the one guttural verbs. There's only one place where there's a slight difference. Look at the Hiphil perfect category with me. You will see in the Hiphil perfect category, the vowel under the hey prefix that's diagnostic of the Hiphil stem has changed from hirik to sagol. That's the only change in the one guttural category. Now you know why that change occurs. You've seen in other stems, particularly the cow stem, that in the one guttural category there's this preference for either the sagol or the pathic pattern. That's the pattern that obtains here. Once you recognize that same pattern, you're learning nothing new. You're taking what you already know from the cow stem and applying it here. Everything else in the one guttural category is identical to the Hiphil strong verb. So there's nothing new to memorize here. There's just one new application of something you already know. Let's look at our next weak verb, the third chet ayin category. Third chet ayin. You'll see on your screen, as you look at the forms, that almost all of the strong verb diagnostics are maintained. They are identical in the perfect, the imperfect, the infinitive construct, the infinitive absolute, and the participle. There's one slight change in the imperative. In the imperative category, the top form, the imperative 2ms, hashlech, you will see that the stem vowel has changed from tsere to pathic. Now that shift in stem vowel is based upon the fact that it's a guttural consonant, and gutturals prefer A-class vowels, and in this particular instance, it's changed to an A-class vowel. But if you look at your screen again, you'll notice that that's the only change on your screen. Now you know that gutturals prefer A-class vowels, so once again, you're taking something you already know and applying it to a new situation. Because the strong verb diagnostics for the Hiphil stem are maintained with third chet ayin verbs, except in that one instance, there's no need to memorize all of the different forms that you see here. The diagnostic features are already familiar to you from your work with the strong verb. So both the one guttural category and the third chet ayin category maintain 99.9% of all the strong verb diagnostics, and the slight changes that you do see are types of changes you've already encountered elsewhere. Piece of cake. Let's look at our third type of weak verb for the Hiphil stem, the third aleph weak verbs. Look at your screen with me. Here you will see that all of the strong verb diagnostics are maintained except in one place. Look at the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, the infinitive absolute, and the participle. In all of those forms, the strong verb diagnostics are maintained, so there's nothing we need to discuss for those forms. But let's pay some special attention to the perfect. The first form, the perfect 3ms, exhibits all of the strong verb diagnostics. You'll see the hey hirik prefix and then the hirik yod stem vowel. Now from your study of the strong verb in the Hiphil stem, you'll recall that the alternative stem vowel besides the hirik yod is the pathic. Well, with third aleph verbs, the stem vowel changes from pathic to tsere. Now that particular change is fairly dramatic, pathic to tsere, but you also know that the stem vowel for the Hiphil stem is interchangeable between hirik yod and tsere, and so with the third aleph verbs there is apparently more consistency. That is, in every form that you see on the screen, the stem vowel will either be hirik yod or tsere in the third aleph category. So that's one slight change, and that one slight change doesn't necessitate you having to memorize anything new on this particular page. All of the strong verb diagnostics should be recognizable to you here, except for that one change. We now move to the third hey category of weak verb in the Hiphil stem, And here's where we begin to see some more dramatic types of changes with the weak verbs. Look at your screen with me. With third hey weak verbs, you see in each of the forms on your screen the diagnostic features for third hey verbs marked in gray or highlighted in gray. All of those gray forms are those forms we've been studying in the Cal stem, the Nifal stem, the PL stem, the Pual stem, and now the Hiphil stem. Meaning this, you should be very familiar by now with all of the unique endings for third hey weak verbs. But go back to your screen. You will see highlighted in red on all of your diagnostic forms only those things that appear at the front of the verb. For example, in the perfect, the hey hearic. In the imperfect and the participle, pathic, preformative, or prefix vowels. And then in the imperative, the infinitive construct, and infinitive absolute, hey pathic. The diagnostic features for third hey verbs in the Hiphil stem occur only at the front of the verb. Let me put it this way. The verbs are Hiphil at the front and third hey at the end. The verbs are Hiphil at the front and third hey at the end, meaning this, all of the stem vowels in the third hey verbs have been bleached out by the third hey reality. So they're Hiphil at the front and third hey at the end. Now, because you know about the Hiphil diagnostics at the front and what they are, you can identify all of these verbs as Hiphil, even though the stem vowels have been bleached out because of the third hey weakness. So let me remind you of the third hey endings that are important to review. Look at your screen again. Once again, you've seen these in the Cal, the Nifal, the PL, the Pual, and now the Hiphil. These are the important diagnostic endings for third hey verbs in all stems. In the perfect 3ms, comets hey. In the 5 imperfect forms without a sufformative, segol hey. In the imperative 2ms, tsere hey. In the infinitive construct, holem wow tau or oath. And in the masculine singular participle, segol hey. These endings will appear in all the third hey verbs you see in the Hiphil stem, and it will cause the stem vowels to get bleached out that you normally rely on in your identification of Hiphil verbs. So with this particular weak verb class, pay special attention. We'll now move on to our next weak verb category, the one noon weak verbs in the Hiphil stem. Look at your screens with me. The good news is, all of the Hiphil strong verb diagnostics are maintained in every form that you see on your screen, in the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, infinitive construct, infinitive absolute, and participle. They're all there. Everything highlighted in red is what you've already memorized in the Hiphil strong verb category. So why do we have this on the screen here? And it's for this reason. You will see in every form only 2 root letters, not 3. The verbal root here is natsal, noon, tzade, lamed. But on your screen, in every form, you only see tzade, lamed. So the question becomes, where did that noon go? By now, I hope you should know what has happened to that noon. In every instance, the noon in first root position has assimilated as a dogish forte into the second root letter. Look at your screens again. You will see in every form on your screen the consonant tzade with a dogish forte in the middle of it. That dogish forte in the tzade represents the assimilated noon of the verbal root. So in this particular category, it's not tough to identify the form as Hiphil. It's difficult to identify the verbal root. How do you properly reconstruct the verbal root so that you know when you look this form up in the lexicon to look up its meaning, you know that you've got to look up the noon, the tzade, and the lamed, not just tzade lamed. If you look up tzade lamed, you will not find the right verb. The way you properly reconstruct this root, you engage in Hebrew CSI, and you recognize that the dogish forte in the tzade represents the assimilated noon. And so you reconstruct the noon, you reconstruct the crime scene, you replace the noon so you can properly identify the verbal root, both for parsing and for use in the lexicon. Okay? Now, have you seen a noon assimilate before? You bet. You've seen it since the very beginning in our noun chapters. You've seen noons assimilating. You've seen noons assimilating in the Nifal stem. This is nothing new. We're simply taking those principles of morphology you've already learned and reapplying them here, reinforcing what you know, and then expanding your gaze to other avenues where those same things occur. It's becoming good Hebrew morphology students. We're just taking those very few things that govern the whole system and telling you they apply here, they apply here, they apply here. The more often you see those, the better they will be reinforced in your brain and the easier it will be for you to read Hebrew. Now let's move to the one-yod weak verb category in the Hiphil stem, the one-yod verbs. Look at your screen. Now immediately you will notice that something's happened with these verbs here. But you already know what has happened and why. First, let's just observe that there's something unique about the one-yod verb in the Hiphil stem. And it's this. There's a holem wow following the prefix or preformative in every form. In the perfect, imperfect, imperative, both infinitives and the participle, you will see a holem wow highlighted in red. The question is, where do those holem wows come from? And you already know the answer. The answer is that most one-yod verbs in Hebrew were originally one wow. Now, we encountered this first in the Nifal stem, where you saw those one-yod verbs taking either the consonant wow or a holem wow. The same thing is happening here. These verbs, these one-yod verbs that were originally one wow, in the Hiphil stem, that original wow reappears in every instance, in every form of every conjugation, as holem wow. So let's look at our screens again. In the perfect, you'll see that the hey prefix and the stem vowels are maintained. The only difference is that the heric under the prefix has changed to holem wow. If you can recognize that that holem wow is diagnostic of the one-yod weak verb category, you'll be able to identify the verbs both as Hiphil and as one-yod from Yeshav. That is properly identifying the verbal root and the verbal stem. In the imperfect, likewise, the heric yod stem vowel is maintained. However, the pathic under the preformative has changed to holem wow. If you can recognize that the holem wow is diagnostic of the one-yod weak verb class, you can properly identify both the verbal root and the verbal stem. The very same thing occurs for the imperative, the infinitive construct, and the infinitive absolute. The pathic under the hey prefix in the imperative, infinitive construct, and the infinitive absolute has changed to holem wow. That's because this verb is one yod, and one yod verbs used to be one wow, and the wow reappears as holem wow. Have I said that enough yet? Look at the participle. You maintain the mem prefix that is now becoming very important to identify participles. You also maintain the heric yod stem vowel, but the change is the holem wow. Now, if you recognize that the holem wow is diagnostic of the one yod weak verb class because one yod weak verbs were originally one wow, you can properly identify the verbal root and the verbal stem and the conjugation. Now, the changes are distinct and fairly major in this particular weak verb class because that holem wow is a big feature. That holem wow is a big feature. It stands out big and bold. And so you're initially maybe kind of caught off guard or distracted by the size of that vowel following the prefix or the preformatives or following the prefixes or the preformatives. Okay? But don't be discouraged. Simply remember that that wow is diagnostic of the fact that this is a one-yod verb. You got to think of it this way. When you're tackling weak verb morphology, just verb morphology in general, you're trying to think about a number of different things. One, how can I properly identify a verbal root where a root letter has dropped out? Number two, how can I properly identify the verbal stem? What makes it kal, nifal, piel? And then three, what are the features that help me to identify the proper conjugation? If there's a mem prefix, it's participle. If there's a preformative and a subformative, it's imperfect. If there's only a subformative, it's probably a perfect. Those are the features that you're working to use in your arsenal of Hebrew CSI tools to properly identify verbs. You're looking for items that mark the stem, the conjugation, and the verbal root when there's been a verbal root dropping out. So keep these things in mind. It's much easier to learn how verbs work than it is to memorize 50,000 paradigms that you'll never remember a month after your Hebrew class is over. Know how the verbs work. Don't memorize paradigms. So let's look at our screens and you'll see both the Hiphil and the Nifal of one-yod verbs compared. Look with me at your screens. Most one-yod verbs were originally one wow. In the Nifal, the original wow reappears as either holem wow or as the consonantal wow with the assimilated noon of the Niphal stem. So you can see that in that first line of examples there, noshav, yiwashev, hiwashev, hiwashev, noshav. You can see that wow reappearing. That's diagnostic of the one-yod weak verb category. In the Hifil, the original wow reappears as holem wow in every form of every conjugation. Hoshiv, yoshiv, yoshev, hoshiv, hoshev, moshiv. The holem wow in all of those forms is diagnostic of the one-yod weak verb category because these verbs used to be one wow. Once you know that, you're ready to move on to the next category. We now come to the biconsonantal verb in the Hifil stem. This is by far the trickiest and most difficult weak verb in the Hifil stem. Let's look at your screens together to consider biconsonantal verbs in the Hifil stem. One of the first things you'll notice is that this is the verbal root kum, kof, shurik, mem. This is the U class biconsonantal verb. But you will clearly see that the U class vowel in the biconsonantal kum has changed to either hirik yod or tsere in every form. Now you know that the Hifil stem loves the hirik yod tsere stem vowel. And so when it gets hold of biconsonantal verbs, either in the hirik yod, the shurik, or the holem wow class, it doesn't matter which medial vowel class you're working with in the biconsonantal, in the Hifil stem, it will always change that medial vowel letter to hirik yod or tsere. So that's the first thing you need to be aware of. The second thing that we can rely on is that we're going to see in the perfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, the infinitive absolute, the hey prefix. So in 4 of the 6 conjugations, the hey prefix diagnostic of the Hifil stem is maintained. The most radical change that you'll see in these forms is the vowel under the Hifil prefix or the yod performative or participle prefix. Let's begin with the perfect. In the perfect, the strong verb prefix is hey with hirik. Hey with hirik, the short I. In the biconsonantal weak verb class, it's shifted from hirik to tsere or to hatef pathic. So you've got to memorize the fact that with biconsonantal verbs, the prefix vowel in the Hifil has changed from hirik to either tsere or hatef pathic. In the imperfect, let's move to the imperfect. You normally consider the pathic to be diagnostic of the Hifil stem in the perfect when it appears under the preformative vowel. Well, in the imperfect, in the biconsonantal class, the pathic has lengthened to comets. The pathic has lengthened to comets. In fact, in the imperative and in the infinitive construct and in the infinitive absolute, you can see that the pathic vowel, normally under the Hifil prefix, has lengthened to comets. You must memorize this change. Finally, in the participle, you normally would expect to see a pathic under the mem prefix of the participle inflection. But it's changed. In this case, it's the tsere prefix vowel that is diagnostic of the Hifil participle in the biconsonantal weak verb class. Now, this is the most difficult weak verb in the Hifil stem. And so there are 2 options. One, you can work really hard to memorize all of the different changes here and why they occur. Or you can just simply memorize these forms like a paradigm and know that in this particular weak verb class, I simply must memorize the Hifil stem verbs in the biconsonantals because they're just too weird to master in terms of what morphologically goes on. That's fine. In either case, you must be able to reconstruct the verbal root, knowing that the hirik yod must be changed back to the shurik in this particular case to properly look up the form in the lexicon or identify it in parsing. And then just remember, with biconsonantal verbs, the prefix and preformative vowels change. They change. And so you'll need to spend extra time mastering the verbs in this particular pattern, this particular biconsonantal pattern with Hifil stem verbs. I frequently like to say in Hebrew, this is really easy. It's something you already know. We're applying it. You know something new here, but it's easy, this or that. Let me just confess to you that when it comes to the Hifil stem and biconsonantal verbs, in this one small case, there's nothing easy about it. Sola bootstrappa. You must pull yourself up by your bootstraps, memorize these forms, or in context, you'll be lost. And you don't want to be lost when you're translating the Hebrew Bible. Well, let's look at our final screen now, conclude our lecture by recognizing all the different things that we've encountered in this chapter when it comes to Hiffield stem verbs that are weak. Here is a summary of Hiffield diagnostics for strong and weak verbs. Now, as you look at your screen, don't be paralyzed by all of the different forms that you see. Begin by having mastered the strong verb column at the very top. Memorize it like a robot, even better than a robot. Then you'll realize that 99% of all the strong verb diagnostics occur in the one guttural, third chet ayin, and third aleph categories. So there's really nothing you need to memorize there. There are some slight changes, but you already know the reasons for those changes. In the third hey category, you just need to remember that it's Hiffield at the front and third hey at the end. Now, because you know Hiffield verb diagnostics at the front, there's nothing new at the front to memorize. And because you already know what the third hey verb diagnostics are at the end, there's nothing new to memorize. You're simply putting the two together. You're just putting two things that you already know together in a new context. The last three categories on your screen are a little trickier. In the one noon category, all of the Hiffield strong verb diagnostics are present. It's the verbal root that's difficult to identify. In the one noon category, the noon in first root position will assimilate as a doggish forte to the second root position, and so you'll have to reconstruct with your Hebrew CSI skills that doggish forte represents the assimilated noon. That doggish forte represents the assimilated noon. In the one yod category, you'll see that the vast majority of strong verb diagnostics are maintained. The big change, the glaring change you see on your screen now, is the holem wow that follows the prefix or preformative in every form. That holem wow is diagnostic of the fact that one yod verbs were originally one wow, something we taught you in the Nifal stem. In the Hiffield stem, that original wow reappears as holem wow in every form of every conjugation. In the bicontinental class, it's like a bomb went off. You've simply got to memorize all those changes. Remember, the stem vowels are good, the prefixes and preformatives are good. It's that vowel under the prefix or preformative that's really changing. So focus on that and you'll be good to go. Well, that concludes our study of Hiffield stem weak verbs. This is perhaps the most difficult weak verb chapter in the derived stems. So you want to minimize it as much as possible. If something's the same as the strong verb, don't focus on it because you already know it. Only memorize those points where there's a departure of the strong verb, and you'll memorize the weak verbs with economy. We'll see you next time.